My husband kept insisting there was no intruder in our house, and he was right. She wasn't an intruder at all. She was something much worse. I dropped my suitcase in the hallway and whispered to my husband Carl, "Honey, I think there's someone in our house." He continued scrolling through his phone completely unbothered. "You're just tired from the flight." He patted the spot beside him on the living room couch, but I heard it again. A small shuffling sound. "Carl, I'm serious. I think there's someone in our room." I kept my voice low. He gripped my elbow tight, stopping me from climbing up the steps. "My cutie cakes, you've been traveling for 3 days straight working. You're exhausted. Just take a rest on the couch for a bit." But then I heard the sound of glass shattering and knew it wasn't just my imagination. "Stay here if you want, but I'm checking it out right now." I sprinted upstairs and started with our walk-in closet. Everything looked normal except for my lingerie drawer, which clearly had signs that it was tampered with, and glass on the bathroom floor. But no intruder. But as I moved to check under the bed, the door slammed shut behind me. I jumped and Carl appeared in the doorway. "It's just the wind. The window's probably open." But there was no draft, no breeze. I glanced at the window and noticed it was shut. I bent down and grabbed the baseball bat we kept beside the nightstand. Carl's eyes went wide. "What are you doing? If someone's really here, we should call the police." "Call the police? They couldn't even find my own son's killer years ago. I didn't need them. Besides, I was confident. My entire family learned karate growing up. I wasn't afraid of a random lingerie thief breaking into my home." I stepped into the hallway and immediately noticed the rug near the guest room had been moved. Just slightly, like someone had rushed past it. I went room by room, office, guest room, bathroom, all clear. One room left. Carl grabbed my arm roughly. "Please just stop before someone gets hurt. Let me handle this," he begged. But before I could answer, I saw her. A blonde woman sprinting down the stairs. "Stop!" I got to the bottom and immediately started searching from room to room, holding the bat over my shoulder, ready to strike. I searched the living room, kitchen, dining room. Then I heard movement in the garage. I took one step in and scanned the room carefully, warning, "I know you're here. Come out slowly before I beat the crap out of you for breaking into my home." No response. But after scanning the room again, I managed to spot her feet sticking out from under the parked car. "I can see you. Get out of there now." The woman listened, but instead of giving up, she bolted past me to the back door, but the knob had gotten stuck, so she ran for the front door. Her hands shook as she screamed and sobbed, working at the triple lock setup. When she finally got it open, it was too late. She made it 2 steps onto the front porch before I tackled her. We both hit the ground hard. The baseball bat rolled across the concrete with us. That's when she screamed, "Carl! Tell her to get off me." I blinked at her, all the anger replaced with surprise. Carl, who was standing in the doorway, turned completely white while he thought about who to help. The woman thrashed under me, screaming again, "Carl, please!" I loosened my grip and stared at her. "How do you know my husband's name?" She didn't answer, just looked at Carl with these desperate eyes, pleading eyes, like she expected him to save her. And that's when everything clicked into place. Carl's dismissive attitude, constantly insisting I just go to sleep, the panicked look when I insisted on finding the intruder, even the way he kept trying to stop me from searching. "Oh my God," I said, standing and stumbling away from the two of them. "You were having an affair, and you made her wear my clothes?" I pointed at the bright red lingerie the blonde woman was wearing. It was sickening. "How long, Carl?" I asked sharply. The woman sat up shaking. "It just happened tonight. I swear. It was just a stupid mistake, and I know I should have just come out instead of giving chase, but I was scared. This was my first really bad decision," she explained, wiping her eyes. "I'm so sorry." I looked at Carl, at this man I'd been married to for 8 years who still hadn't apologized. I almost laughed at the way he couldn't meet my eyes. I looked at her more closely. She was much younger, cute, but the look in her eyes was far from innocent. They were cold and calculating. So I asked the question that had been bugging me the entire time. "If you were just here for an affair, why do you have a knife in the pocket of your jacket?" Suddenly, her entire expression changed. The embarrassment vanished. Then she grinned and kicked me square in the chest, making me fall backward onto the porch. "Oh, this little thing?" she asked, pulling it out for Carl to see too. "I call this thing Vendetta. Would you like to know why?" She giggled. I pushed myself backward on the concrete, my palms scraping against the rough surface as Carter took a step closer. The knife caught the porch light and I could see it was small but sharp, the kind you'd use to gut a fish. Carl stood frozen in the doorway, his face white as paper, his mouth opening and closing like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Carter twirled the blade in a slow circle, her grin getting wider with each rotation. She looked down at me with those cold eyes and started talking in this weird sing-song voice that made my skin crawl. She said the knife was special, that she'd been carrying it for 3 years waiting for the right moment. My chest hurt from where she'd kicked me, but I kept my eyes locked on hers, trying to figure out what she meant. Then she said my son's name. Milo. She said it like she knew him, like they'd been friends or something. My whole body went rigid and I felt this rush of anger, so strong I thought I might throw up. Before I could ask what the hell she was talking about, a voice cut through the night air from across the street. Mrs. Hutchinson, my neighbor who always wore those ugly floral dresses, came running out of her house in her bathrobe. She was screaming that she was calling 911, waving her phone in the air like a weapon. Carter's expression changed instantly. The playful look vanished and her jaw clenched tight. She glanced between me, Carl, and Mrs. Hutchinson's house, and I could practically see her brain working, calculating if she had enough time to do whatever she'd come here to do. That split second of distraction was all I needed. I swept my leg out hard and fast, catching Carter behind her ankles just like my karate instructor taught me when I was 12. She went down hard, her arms windmilling as she tried to catch herself. The knife flew out of her hand and skittered across the porch, the metal scraping against concrete. We both lunged for it at the same time, our hands reaching, but I was faster. My fingers closed around the handle and I rolled away, pushing myself up onto my knees. I pointed the blade at Carter, my hand shaking but my grip solid. My chest throbbed where she'd kicked me, and each breath felt like someone was squeezing my ribs. Carter sat up slowly, holding her hands out like she was trying to calm a wild animal. That's when Carl finally moved. But he didn't help me. He didn't grab Carter or check if I was okay. Instead, he rushed over and grabbed my wrist, the one holding the knife, and tried to twist it out of my hand. I stared at him in shock, unable to process what was happening. My own husband, the man I'd been married to for 8 years, was trying to disarm me while the woman who just attacked me sat 3 feet away. The betrayal hit me harder than Carter's kick ever could. I yanked my arm free from Carl's grip, using a quick twist move that broke his hold. I scrambled backward, putting distance between myself and both of them, keeping the knife raised and pointed forward. Sirens wailed in the distance, getting louder with each passing second. Carter started laughing, this high-pitched sound that made her seem totally unhinged. She looked at Carl with pure disgust on her face and told him he was pathetic. She said he couldn't even complete one simple task she'd given him. She said now everything was ruined because of his incompetence. I looked between them, trying to understand what task she meant, what Carl was supposed to do. 2 police cars came screaming around the corner, their lights painting everything red and blue. They pulled up to the curb and 4 officers jumped out, hands on their weapons. They found all 3 of us on the front porch in this weird standoff, with me holding the knife and backing away from both Carter and Carl. One officer shouted for me to drop the weapon, and I did immediately, letting it clatter to the porch. I raised my hands and started talking fast, telling them about the break-in, about finding Carter in my house, about what she said regarding my son. 2 officers moved in to separate us, while a third went over to Mrs. Hutchinson, who was standing on her lawn in her bathrobe. She was talking a mile a minute, gesturing wildly at all of us, clearly giving them a play-by-play of everything she'd witnessed. About 15 minutes later, an unmarked car pulled up and a woman in a dark suit got out. She had short black hair and moved with this confidence that made it clear she was in charge. One of the officers called her Detective Reyes. She walked straight to me and introduced herself as Fiona. When I mentioned Milo's name while explaining what Carter had said, Fiona's whole expression changed. She told me she was familiar with his cold case file, that she'd actually reviewed it a few months ago. She separated me from Carl and Carter, taking me inside the house while the other officers kept them on the porch. Paramedics had arrived and one of them followed us in, carrying a medical bag. Fiona sat me down on the living room couch and started asking questions while the paramedic checked my chest where Carter had kicked me. I explained everything from the moment I walked in and heard the shuffling sound upstairs. I told her about finding the lingerie drawer tampered with, chasing Carter through the house, tackling her on the porch. I described the knife she called Vendetta, and how she said it had something to do with Milo. Fiona's face got more serious with each detail I shared. She pulled out her phone and showed me a photo, asking if this was the woman who broke in. I confirmed it was Carter. Fiona told me that wasn't her real name, that she'd been on their radar for several months in connection with a series of break-ins around the city. But she said nothing like this had ever happened before, nothing violent or personal. Through the front window, I watched as officers put handcuffs on both Carter and Carl. My husband was protesting loudly, his voice carrying through the glass. He kept saying he was the victim, that I was the one who'd attacked them both. Fiona explained they were arresting Carter for assault and breaking and entering. She said Carl was detained for questioning because of how he'd interfered during the attack, how he'd tried to take the knife from me instead of helping restrain Carter. The paramedic pressed against my ribs and I winced. He said I needed to go to the hospital to get checked for cracked bones. I started to argue, but Fiona backed him up, saying I should get looked at properly. Just as they were helping me stand up to walk outside, another car pulled up fast. My sister Valentina jumped out before it even stopped completely. She ran up the driveway, her eyes wide with panic. The paramedics were loading me into the ambulance when she reached us. She climbed in without asking permission, sitting on the bench next to the stretcher and grabbing my hand. She asked what the hell happened, her voice shaking. That's when everything hit me all at once. The break-in, the affair, the knife, Carter's words about Milo, Carl's betrayal. I broke down crying, the sobs making my chest hurt even worse. Valentina squeezed my hand tighter and told me it was okay, that she was here now. I tried to explain through the tears, but the words came out jumbled and confused. The ambulance started moving, and I watched through the back windows as my house got smaller, the police lights still flashing across the front porch where my entire life had just fallen apart. The ambulance pulled into the emergency room bay, and paramedics opened the back doors. Valentina climbed out first and stayed close while they wheeled me inside on the stretcher. The fluorescent lights hurt my eyes after the darkness of the ride. A nurse directed us to an exam room where a doctor came in almost immediately. He pressed his fingers along my ribs one by one while I tried not to wince. He asked me to take deep breaths and rate my pain on a scale of 1 to 10. I said 7 because talking hurt. The doctor ordered x-rays and told me they wanted to keep me overnight for observation. Valentina pulled out her phone and started making calls while I changed into a hospital gown. She canceled my meetings for the next week and arranged for a security company to board up my broken bathroom window and change the locks. Her voice stayed calm and professional, even though I could see her hands shaking. The x-ray technician wheeled me down a long hallway to radiology. I stared at the ceiling tiles and counted them to avoid thinking about Carter's knife or Carl's face when he tried to protect her instead of me. The technician positioned the machine over my chest and stepped behind a protective screen. The x-rays took 10 minutes and then they wheeled me back to the exam room where Valentina was still on the phone. She hung up when she saw me and squeezed my hand. The doctor returned with the x-ray results confirming severe bruising across my chest and ribs, but no fractures or breaks. He said I was lucky Carter hadn't kicked harder or aimed lower. They moved me to a regular room on the 3rd floor where I could rest. Valentina sat in the chair beside my bed and pulled out her laptop to handle more work calls for me. A knock on the door interrupted us around 9 that evening. A man in a dark suit walked in and introduced himself as Detective Sean, Fiona's partner. He apologized for bothering me but said he needed more details about what Carter had said regarding Milo. Valentina stood up protectively, but I told her it was okay. Sean pulled a chair closer to my bed and took out a small notebook. He asked me to explain everything Carter had mentioned about my son. I told him Milo was murdered 3 years ago when he was 19. Someone killed him in an alley downtown near the warehouse district. I found out when 2 officers showed up at my door at 2 in the morning. They said a jogger had discovered his body around midnight. The police investigated for 6 months but never found who did it. I pushed them constantly for answers, called the station every week, met with detectives, but they had nothing. No witnesses, no security footage, no suspects. Eventually they told me the case was going cold and there was nothing more they could do. Sean wrote everything down and asked specific questions about the location and the original investigation. He wanted to know if Milo had enemies or was involved in anything dangerous. I explained that Milo was a good kid studying business at the community college and working part-time at Carl's company. He had no reason to be in that alley at that time of night. Sean closed his notebook and thanked me for the information. Then Sean told me something that made my stomach drop. Carter had refused to say anything without a lawyer present, but when they searched her jacket, they found more than just the knife. She had a photo of Milo in her pocket, one of him at his high school graduation. She also had an old newspaper clipping about his death folded up small. The police had photographed both items as evidence. Sean showed me pictures on his phone. The photo was one I recognized from our mantel at home, the same one I looked at every morning. Seeing it in Carter's possession made my skin crawl. The newspaper article was from the local paper 3 days after Milo died, with his school picture and a headline about the unsolved murder. Someone had highlighted certain sentences about the investigation. My hand started shaking so badly that Sean had to take his phone back. This wasn't random. Carter hadn't just broken into my house for an affair with Carl. She had targeted me specifically because of my son. But why? What connection did she have to Milo? I asked Sean if they knew anything about Carter's background, or how she might have known my son. He said they were still investigating, but so far her records showed she grew up 2 towns over and had no obvious connection to our family. Valentina moved closer and put her arm around my shoulders. I couldn't stop staring at the hospital wall, trying to make sense of how a stranger could have my dead son's photo. 6 hours later, Fiona called Valentina's phone. Carl had been released from questioning. The police couldn't prove he knew Carter planned to hurt me, so they had to let him go. Fiona said privately they were pulling his phone records and looking into how long he'd known Carter and what he might have known about her plans. Valentina's phone started buzzing constantly after that. Carl was calling and texting nonstop, begging to talk to me. Valentina showed me some of the messages. He claimed he was sorry, that he never meant for any of this to happen, that he loved me and wanted to explain everything. I told Valentina to block his number. I didn't want to hear his excuses or his lies. The man I'd been married to for 8 years had betrayed me in the worst possible way, and then tried to protect my attacker. There was nothing he could say that would make any of this okay. Fiona texted that they were still holding Carter on assault and breaking and entering charges. Her bail hearing was scheduled for the next morning. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but kept seeing Carter's grin when she pulled out that knife. Valentina left around midnight to get some clothes and toiletries from her apartment. She came back an hour later with a bag full of my favorite comfortable clothes and all my bathroom supplies. She sat on the edge of my hospital bed and asked where I wanted to stay when they discharged me in the morning. I couldn't go back to that house. The thought of sleeping in the bed where Carl had betrayed me made me want to throw up. The thought of walking into that closet where Carter had hidden wearing my lingerie made my skin itch. I asked if I could stay with Valentina for a few days until I figured out what to do next. She said of course, and that she'd already made up her guest room for me. The nurse came in to check my vital signs and give me pain medication. Valentina dimmed the lights and settled into the chair beside my bed. She said she'd stay all night in case I needed anything. I finally fell asleep around 3 in the morning with my sister holding my hand. The next morning, they discharged me with instructions to rest and take it easy for at least a week. Valentina drove me to her apartment across town, a small 2-bedroom place with big windows overlooking a park. She helped me get settled in the guest room and made me tea while I tried to process everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. Around noon, someone knocked on the apartment door. Fiona stood in the hallway holding a large cardboard box. Valentina let her in, and Fiona set the box on the dining table. She asked if I felt up to looking through Milo's old case files. She admitted the original detective, Hannah Thompson, had retired last year, but Fiona had been reviewing the file recently and found some things that bothered her. She thought maybe I could help identify inconsistencies or details that didn't add up. I told her I'd do anything to help figure out why Carter had my son's photo. Fiona opened the box and pulled out thick folders filled with papers, photos, and evidence logs. She spread them across the table and warned me that some of the crime scene photos were difficult to look at. I nodded and sat down. Valentina sat beside me and squeezed my hand. I spent the next 4 hours going through every document in that box. Crime scene photos showed the alley where Milo died, the dumpster, the blood on the concrete. Witness statements from people who lived nearby but hadn't seen or heard anything useful. Evidence logs listing items collected from the scene. My hands shook so badly that Valentina had to help me turn pages. I was reliving the worst period of my life, seeing details I'd never known before about how my son died. Valentina pointed out things I was too emotional to notice clearly. She stopped on one witness statement about halfway through the stack. A man who lived in an apartment overlooking the alley had reported seeing a young blonde woman near the entrance around the time of Milo's death. He said she looked upset and was on her phone. The police had tried to find her but never identified who she was. The description said she appeared to be in her late teens or early 20s, slim build, wearing jeans and a dark jacket. Valentina looked at me and asked if I thought it could have been Carter. The age would have been right. Carter was 22 now, which meant she would have been 19 when Milo died. Fiona came back from making phone calls and I showed her the witness statement about the blonde woman. She read it carefully and confirmed that woman was never identified or found despite being a potential witness. The original detective had followed up on the lead for about 2 weeks, but it went nowhere. Now we were all wondering if that blonde woman could have been Carter. The timeline matched perfectly. Fiona pulled out her phone and showed me Carter's booking photo from last night. I compared it to the physical description in the witness statement. Height, build, hair color, all of it fit. But why would Carter have been at the scene of Milo's murder? Was she involved somehow? Did she know who killed him? My mind raced with possibilities and none of them made sense. Fiona said she'd request a warrant to search Carter's apartment and see what else they could find. She packed up the case files and told me to rest. But I couldn't rest. I needed answers about why this woman had been stalking my family. I told Fiona I wanted to speak with Hannah Thompson, the retired detective who worked Milo's case. I needed to know why the blonde witness was never pursued more seriously, why that lead was allowed to go cold. Fiona made some calls and arranged a meeting at Hannah's home for that afternoon. We drove across town to a quiet neighborhood with old trees lining the streets. Hannah's house was a small ranch style with flower beds in front. An older woman with gray hair answered the door and greeted us with a sad smile. She said she remembered me from all the times I'd called the station about Milo's case. We sat in her living room and I asked directly about the blonde woman witness. Hannah's face showed discomfort when I mentioned it. She admitted she always felt something was off about that witness report. Her supervisor at the time had pushed her to focus on other leads that seemed more promising, but ultimately went nowhere. She said the pressure came from above to close the case quickly and move on to other investigations. Hannah stood up and walked to a bookshelf in the corner. She pulled out a worn notebook and brought it back to the couch. She explained these were her personal notes from the investigation, things she kept separate from the official file. She flipped through pages filled with handwritten observations and sketches. She stopped on a page dated 2 weeks after Milo's death. There was a sketch artist's rendering of the blonde woman based on the witness description. My breath caught in my throat. The drawing looked disturbingly similar to Carter. Same face shape, same eyes, same hair length. Hannah said she'd always wondered about that woman and regretted not pushing harder to find her. She asked if this had something to do with what happened at my house yesterday. I told her everything about Carter breaking in, the knife, the photo of Milo, the newspaper clipping. Hannah's expression darkened, and she said she'd testify about the pressure she faced if it helped connect Carter to Milo's death. Fiona thanked her, and we left with copies of Hannah's personal notes. In the car, I stared at the sketch of the blonde woman, and knew without doubt it was Carter. But I still didn't know why she was there that night, or what she knew about who killed my son. Fiona dropped me off at Valentina's apartment and promised to call as soon as she had updates. I watched her drive away, then went inside and collapsed on my sister's couch. My phone buzzed 20 minutes later with a text from Fiona saying the judge approved the warrant, and they were heading to Carter's apartment now. I wanted to be there, to see what they found, but Fiona said I had to stay away to avoid any claims of evidence tampering. So I sat on that couch staring at my phone, waiting. Valentina made tea that I didn't drink and tried to get me to eat something, but my stomach was too twisted up. 3 hours passed before Fiona called. Her voice sounded different, more serious than before. She said they found a storage unit key taped inside Carter's bedroom closet, hidden behind a loose piece of baseboard. The key had a number on it and they tracked it to a facility across town. When they opened the unit, they found boxes stacked floor to ceiling. Fiona said every single box contained items related to my family. There were photos of me, Carl, and Milo taken over several years from different angles and locations. Some looked like they were taken from a car parked down the street from our house. Others showed us at restaurants, the grocery store, even at Milo's grave on the anniversary of his death. Fiona said there were also newspaper clippings about Milo's murder, printed articles from online news sites, and what looked like a journal where Carter had written notes about our daily routines and schedules. I felt sick hearing all of this. The affair wasn't random. Carter had been watching us for years, planning something, and I had no idea why. Fiona came to Valentina's apartment the next morning with a folder full of photos from the storage unit. She spread them across the dining table, and I forced myself to look at each one. The earliest photos were dated over 3 years ago, just weeks after Milo died. There were pictures of our house, our cars, even shots of me leaving for work in the morning. The later photos showed Carl more frequently, like Carter had shifted her focus to him specifically. Fiona pointed to a series of images showing Carl at a coffee shop, the gym, his office building. She said it looked like Carter had been following him and learning his patterns before making contact. The evidence suggested Carter deliberately seduced Carl as part of a larger plan, though her ultimate motive remained unclear. I asked Fiona what she thought Carter wanted, why she would spend years stalking my family and then sleep with my husband. Fiona admitted she didn't know yet, but the level of planning and detail suggested this was about more than just the affair, or even revenge for something. There had to be a deeper connection to Milo's death, something that drove Carter to invest this much time and energy into getting close to us. I stared at a photo of Milo walking to his car the week before he died. Carter had been there, watching him, and I never knew. Later that afternoon, someone knocked hard on Valentina's apartment door. My sister looked through the peephole and her face went pale. Carl stood in the hallway looking terrible. His hair was messy, his clothes wrinkled, and he had dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept. Valentina asked if I wanted her to send him away, but I shook my head. I needed answers about how he met Carter and how long they'd been involved. She opened the door and Carl rushed in, immediately trying to hug me. I stepped back and held up my hand. He stopped, his arms dropping to his sides. I told him to sit down and explain everything. Carl collapsed into a chair and rubbed his face with both hands. He said they met 6 months ago at a coffee shop downtown. She was sitting alone reading a book and he struck up a conversation. They talked for an hour and exchanged numbers. He swore he had no idea she was dangerous or connected to Milo. The affair started a few weeks after that first meeting. He claimed Carter seemed normal, sweet even, and he never suspected anything was wrong. I watched his face as he talked, looking for signs he was lying. His eyes kept darting away from mine and his hands shook slightly. He insisted he would never have gotten involved with her if he'd known about her obsession with our family. I pulled out my phone and showed Carl the photos Fiona had sent me. The ones of him at the coffee shop, at the gym, outside his office. All of them taken over a year ago, months before he claimed they met. I watched the color drain from his face as he looked through the images. He tried to say Carter must have been following him before they met, that it didn't change his timeline. But I kept scrolling and found photos of them together dated 8 months ago, not 6. When I confronted him with this evidence, he broke down. His shoulders started shaking and he buried his face in his hands. After a long silence, he admitted the affair started 8 months ago, not 6. He said he lied because he was ashamed and didn't want me to know how long he'd been cheating. But he swore on everything that he never knew about her obsession with our family. He claimed Carter never mentioned Milo, never asked weird questions about our past, never gave any indication she was stalking us. I asked him about the night I came home and found her in our house. Why did he try so hard to stop me from searching? Why did he protect her when I had her cornered? Carl said he panicked. He knew if I found her, the affair would be exposed and he'd lose me. He admitted that was selfish and stupid, but he wasn't thinking clearly in that moment. 2 days later, Fiona called and asked if I wanted to come to the station. Carter was interrogated and Fiona thought it might help if I observed through the one-way mirror. I agreed immediately. Valentina drove me downtown and we met Fiona in a small observation room next to the interrogation space. Through the glass, I could see Carter sitting at a metal table with a woman in a dark suit beside her. Carter looked different from she had on my porch. Calmer. Almost relaxed. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail and she wore an orange jumpsuit. The lawyer kept whispering to her and Carter would nod occasionally but didn't speak. Fiona and Sean entered the interrogation room and sat across from them. Fiona started asking questions about the break-in, about Carl, about the storage unit. Carter refused to answer, just stared at the wall behind them with a blank expression. Her lawyer repeated the same phrase over and over, that her client was exercising her right to remain silent. Then Sean mentioned Milo's name. He asked Carter directly if she knew my son. For just a second, Carter's mask slipped. Her eyes filled with tears and her mouth twisted like she was trying not to cry. I saw raw grief flash across her face before she caught herself and looked down at the table. She composed herself quickly, wiping her eyes and straightening her shoulders. But I'd seen it. That reaction was real. During a break in the interrogation, Carter's lawyer requested a private meeting with prosecutors to discuss a possible deal. Fiona came into the observation room and warned me that Carter might offer information about Milo's death in exchange for reduced charges. She said I needed to decide if I was willing to let her avoid full punishment to finally learn the truth about what happened to my son. I stared through the glass at Carter, who was now talking quietly with her lawyer. The young woman who broke into my home, wore my clothes, slept with my husband. The woman who'd been stalking my family for years. Part of me wanted her to suffer the maximum penalty for everything she'd done. But a bigger part of me needed to know what happened to Milo. I'd spent 3 years with questions eating away at me, wondering who killed my son and why. If Carter had answers, I had to hear them. I told Fiona I needed the truth more than I needed revenge. That 3 years of not knowing had been torture worse than anything else. Fiona nodded and said she'd tell the prosecutor. An hour later, we sat in a conference room with the lead prosecutor, a thin man with gray hair who introduced himself but whose name I immediately forgot. He explained that Carter's lawyer wanted to present a proffer, which was basically a written statement outlining what information Carter could provide. The prosecutor made it clear they weren't promising any deal until they heard what she had to say and verified it was credible. He asked if I understood, and I said yes. The lawyer entered with a thick folder and handed copies to everyone at the table. I opened mine and started reading. The first page made my hands shake, so badly that Valentina had to hold the papers steady for me. According to the proffer, Carter witnessed Milo's murder, but wasn't the killer. She'd been trying to find evidence to prove who really did it. The revelation stunned everyone in the room because it changed everything we thought we knew about her motives and actions. The prosecutor asked several questions about specific details, and Carter's lawyer answered each one carefully. Fiona kept glancing at me, checking if I was okay. I wasn't, but I needed to hear the rest. The proffer explained that Carter saw a man arguing with Milo in the alley that night 3 years ago. She'd been sitting in her car nearby, having pulled over to answer a phone call. The argument turned violent, and she watched as the man pushed Milo during a heated exchange. Milo stumbled backward and hit his head on the corner of a metal dumpster. He went down hard and didn't get up. The man checked Milo's pulse, panicked, and ran. Carter sat frozen in her car, too scared to move or call for help. Then the man came back a few minutes later and saw her sitting there. He walked up to her window and she rolled it down, terrified. The man told her if she ever said anything about what she saw, he would destroy her life. He said he had power and connections and would make sure she went to prison for Milo's death instead of him. She was 19 years old with a record for petty theft and drug possession. She believed him, so she drove away and never told anyone what she witnessed. But the guilt ate at her every single day. She started following my family, watching us grieve, seeing me beg police for answers. She decided she had to find proof of what really happened, so she could come forward without the man being able to turn the blame on her. The proffer didn't name the killer yet, but it included details about the crime scene that were never made public. Specific things like the position of Milo's body, the angle of the head wound, even the fact that his phone was found 15 feet away from where he fell. Fiona and Sean immediately pulled out their copies of the original case file and started comparing notes. They went through page after page, checking every detail Carter had provided. After 20 minutes, Sean looked up and confirmed that everything matched. There was no way Carter could know these details unless she'd actually been there that night. The prosecutor asked more questions about the timeline, about what Carter saw before and after the incident. Her lawyer answered each one with information from the proffer. I sat there trying to process what I was hearing. Someone pushed my son. Milo didn't die in a random attack. Someone argued with him and it turned violent, and then they threatened a teenage girl into staying silent. I needed to know who. I needed the name of the person who killed Milo and stole 3 years of truth from me. The prosecutor stood and told me they'd arranged for me to observe Carter's next interrogation, that she'd agreed to speak on record about everything she knew. Fiona guided me down a hallway to a small room with a window looking into the interrogation space. I could see Carter sitting at a metal table with her lawyer, looking smaller and younger than she had on my porch with that knife. The prosecutor and another detective entered the interrogation room and sat across from her. Carter's lawyer nodded and she took a deep breath before looking directly at the mirror, like she knew I was standing behind it. She apologized for breaking into my home and scaring me, her voice shaky but clear through the speakers in my observation room. She explained that she'd been searching for evidence Carl kept hidden, documents and files that would prove his involvement in covering up Milo's death. My hands gripped the edge of the table in front of me as I waited for her to continue. The prosecutor asked her to explain what she meant by Carl's involvement. Carter's next words made the room spin around me. She said Carl was the man she saw kill Milo in the alley 3 years ago. My knees buckled and Fiona caught my arm, helping me into a chair. Carter kept talking, explaining how she'd spent years gathering proof, how she got close to Carl through the affair specifically to search his belongings, how she broke into our house that day to find documents she believed he kept in our bedroom safe. I wanted to scream that she was lying, that Carl would never hurt Milo, that this was some sick revenge plot. But even as those thoughts formed, other pieces started clicking into place in my mind. Carl's desperate insistence that I not search the house, his panic when I found Carter hiding, the way he tried to take the knife from me instead of protecting me from her, his complete terror on the porch when everything fell apart. All of it suddenly made horrible sense in a way that made me want to throw up. Fiona squeezed my shoulder and asked if I needed a break, but I shook my head because I needed to hear everything. The prosecutor asked Carter about the timeline, and she provided specific details about that night. Fiona pulled out her tablet and started pulling up Carl's statements from 3 years ago. She showed me the file where Carl claimed he was working late the night Milo died. I stared at the words I'd read dozens of times before, words I'd never questioned because I was drowning in grief and never imagined my husband could be involved. Carl had told me he was at the office until almost midnight, but the file showed he never provided any proof of that. No coworker confirmations, no security footage, no credit card receipts from getting dinner near work. I'd been so consumed with losing Milo that I never questioned Carl's story, never pushed for verification the way I pushed police to find the killer. Carter continued explaining what she witnessed that night. She said Milo had discovered Carl was stealing money from his company and planned to report him. That's what they were arguing about in the alley behind Carl's office building. Carl pushed Milo during the fight and Milo stumbled backward into a metal dumpster. He hit his head on the corner and went down hard. Carl checked his pulse and panicked when he realized Milo was dead. Then he ran. Carter had been sitting in her car nearby, having pulled over to answer a phone call. She watched the whole thing happen. She sat frozen, too scared to move or call for help. Then Carl came back a few minutes later and saw her sitting there. He walked up to her window and she rolled it down, scared out of her mind. Carl told her if she ever said anything about what she saw, he would destroy her life. The prosecutor started making calls immediately, ordering Carl's arrest. Fiona took me to a different window where I could see the station's processing area. Within 20 minutes, 2 officers brought Carl through the doors in handcuffs. He looked around wildly, and then he saw me standing at the window. He started shouting that Carter was lying, that she was crazy and manipulating everyone. His voice got louder and more desperate, but the officers kept walking him toward the holding cells. His panic only made him look more guilty, more like a man who'd been caught instead of a man who'd been wrongly accused. I turned away from the window, unable to watch anymore. Fiona told me they were bringing in forensic accountants to examine Carl's company finances right away. She said if Carter was telling the truth about the money, they'd find proof. I felt Valentina's arms around me before I realized she'd arrived at the station. She held me while I tried to process what I'd just learned. My husband killed our son. Carl killed Milo and then came home and held me while I cried. He attended the funeral and helped me pick out the coffin. He sat with me through police interviews and pretended to want justice as much as I did. For 3 years, he let me believe a random stranger was responsible. For 3 years, he watched me suffer and said nothing. Valentina guided me to the bathroom and I collapsed against the wall, sobbing so hard I couldn't breathe. My entire life was a lie built on Carl's secrets and crimes. Everything I thought I knew about my husband, about our marriage, about that terrible night, all of it was false. The man I'd trusted and loved had killed our son and spent 3 years covering it up. 2 hours later, the prosecutor found me in a conference room where Valentina had taken me to sit quietly. He said the accountants had already found exactly what Carter described. Evidence of stealing going back 4 years. Milo had been working at Carl's company that summer, helping organize old financial records. He must have found the proof of the fraud while doing that boring intern work. The prosecutor explained they had enough to charge Carl with killing Milo and hiding evidence, though proving he planned it ahead of time would be harder. Carter had provided more evidence she'd collected over the years. Recordings of Carl talking in his sleep about the accident, photos she'd taken of documents in his home office when she was there for the affair, copies of threatening text messages Carl had sent her from a burner phone. Everything pointed to Carl being guilty, to him killing Milo and then spending 3 years making sure no one ever found out. Fiona came to get me an hour later, saying Carter's lawyer wanted me to meet with her privately. I followed Fiona to a small meeting room where Carter sat alone, her lawyer having stepped out. She looked at me with red eyes and said she'd been living with guilt for 3 years about not coming forward sooner. She explained that Carl had found her after Milo's death, tracking her down somehow. He warned her he would ruin her life if she ever spoke about what she saw. She was 19 years old with a record for stealing and drugs. She believed him when he said he had the power to make her take the blame for Milo's death instead of him. So she stayed quiet and tried to move on, but the guilt ate at her every day. She started following my family, watching us grieve, seeing me beg police for answers. She decided she had to find proof, so she could come forward without Carl being able to turn everything around on her. That's when she started the affair, getting close to him to search for evidence. She said she never meant to hurt me and actually respected how hard I fought for the truth about Milo. I left that meeting room feeling like my brain couldn't process everything at once. Carter killed no one but watched my son die and said nothing for 3 years because Carl scared her into silence. Then she slept with my husband to find proof. The whole thing made me sick, but I also understood why she did it. An hour later, the prosecutor found me in the hallway and explained they wanted to offer Carter full immunity if she agreed to testify against Carl. He said her testimony was crucial because she was the only witness to what happened in that alley, and without her, they only had circumstantial evidence. I told him I supported the deal even though it felt wrong to let her walk free after everything. Fiona pulled me aside after the prosecutor left and warned me that Carl's defense lawyer would tear Carter apart on the stand. She said they would focus on the affair and the break-in to make Carter look like a crazy woman seeking revenge instead of a credible witness. The trial would be brutal, and there was no guarantee we would win. 2 days later, Carl appeared in court for his bail hearing, and I sat in the back row watching him stand before the judge in an orange jumpsuit. The prosecutor argued he was a flight risk with money hidden overseas and a clear motive to run. Carl's lawyer claimed he was a respected businessman with ties to the community who deserved to await trial at home. The judge denied bail, and Carl's face went white as they led him back to holding. I felt nothing watching him disappear through that door. That same afternoon, I met with Valentina at a lawyer's office downtown to file for divorce. My sister had found someone who handled cases involving criminal defendants and understood how to protect my assets. The lawyer explained that because Carl's crimes directly caused Milo's death and my trauma, I could claim all our marital property. She said the divorce would move fast since Carl couldn't contest anything from jail, and his criminal conviction would make fighting me pointless. I signed the papers without hesitation and felt the first small bit of relief I'd experienced in days. The next 2 months blurred together in a mess of meetings with prosecutors and therapy sessions trying to process everything. I spent hours going over my testimony and reviewing evidence while my therapist helped me work through the betrayal and grief that kept hitting me in waves. Some days I felt strong and ready to face Carl in court. Other days I couldn't get out of bed because the knowledge that I'd shared a home with my son's killer for 3 years made me want to disappear. Valentina stayed with me most nights because being alone meant drowning in thoughts I couldn't escape. About 6 weeks into trial prep, Hannah reached out through Fiona asking if she could meet with me. I agreed, and she came to Valentina's apartment looking older and tired. She sat across from me and apologized for not pursuing the blonde witness more aggressively when she worked Milo's case. Hannah admitted her supervisor back then had business connections to Carl's company and pressured her to close the investigation quickly. She said she always felt something was wrong but couldn't prove it, and eventually got pushed into retirement when she kept asking questions. Hannah offered to testify about the pressure she faced, which could help show Carl used his influence to cover up the crime. I thanked her and told Fiona to add Hannah to the witness list. The trial started on a cold Monday morning in late fall, and I arrived at the courthouse with Valentina gripping my hand. We took seats in the second row behind the prosecution table where I could see everything clearly. Carl sat at the defense table in a suit looking thinner than I remembered, and refusing to look in my direction. His lawyer was a sharp woman in her 50s who spent the first day telling the jury that Carl was a loving father, whose son died in a tragic accident. She painted Milo's death as a terrible mistake that Carl had been living with guilt over for years. I wanted to scream that it was all lies, but I sat quietly and watched. The next day, Carter took the stand wearing a simple blue dress with her hair pulled back. The prosecutor walked her through what she saw that night in the alley 3 years ago. She described hearing Carl and Milo arguing about money and fraud. She explained watching Carl push Milo during the fight and seeing my son hit his head on the dumpster. She talked about being too scared to come forward because Carl found her afterward and threatened to destroy her life. Carter stayed calm even when Carl's lawyer started the cross-examination by asking about the affair. The defense lawyer called her a scorned mistress, who made up this story to get revenge after Carl tried to end things. She asked why anyone should believe a woman who broke into someone's home and assaulted them. Carter never wavered. She looked the lawyer right in the eye and said she broke into my house looking for documents that proved Carl killed Milo, and she was sorry for scaring me, but she never meant to hurt anyone except the man who murdered my son. The prosecutor stood up during redirect and presented forensic evidence of the embezzlement Carl had been hiding. He showed the jury records proving Milo worked at Carl's company that summer and had access to the financial files. Then came the phone records showing Carl called a criminal defense lawyer within an hour of Milo's death. The prosecutor pointed out that Carl called his lawyer before he even called me to say our son was missing. That detail hit me like a punch because I remembered getting that call from Carl hours after Milo died. He told me Milo never came home from work and we should check hospitals. He acted worried and scared when really he already knew Milo was dead in an alley because he put him there. 3 days into the trial, the prosecutor called me to testify. I walked to the witness stand on shaking legs and swore to tell the truth. The prosecutor asked me to describe Carl's behavior after Milo's death. I explained how my husband discouraged me from pushing police for answers. I told the jury about Carl suggesting I see a therapist to help me move on, instead of supporting my search for justice. I described the way he isolated me from friends and made me dependent on him emotionally. Then I broke down crying on the stand as I realized Carl spent 3 years making sure I never found out the truth, because the person I was looking for was him. The judge called a recess and Valentina met me in the hallway holding me while I sobbed. Carl's lawyer spent the next week presenting character witnesses who described him as a devoted husband and father. His co-workers talked about his dedication to the company. His brother claimed Carl loved Milo more than anything, Our former neighbors said we seemed like the perfect family, but the prosecution countered with evidence of Carl's financial crimes going back years. They showed emails where Carl threatened employees who questioned his accounting methods. Valentina took the stand and testified about how Carl isolated me after Milo's death. She described watching her sister become a shell of herself while Carl controlled every aspect of my life. She said Carl kept me away from family gatherings and discouraged me from working or having friends. The jury listened carefully as Valentina explained that Carl's behavior wasn't grief, but calculated control to keep me from discovering his secrets. After 3 weeks of testimony, both sides prepared closing arguments. The prosecutor stood before the jury and laid out a clear timeline of Carl's crimes. He argued that Carl killed Milo to protect his embezzlement scheme, and then spent 3 years covering it up through intimidation and manipulation. He pointed to the phone records, the forensic accounting, Carter's eyewitness testimony, and Carl's suspicious behavior after the death. The defense lawyer countered by calling Carter an unstable woman who fabricated everything to destroy Carl after he tried to end their affair. She argued that the evidence was circumstantial, and the prosecution couldn't prove beyond reasonable doubt that Carl intended to kill Milo. She claimed the death was a tragic accident during an argument, and Carl panicked instead of calling for help. She asked the jury to consider that Carl had been a good husband and father for years, and deserved the benefit of doubt. I sat in that courtroom listening to both versions of what happened and knew which one was true. The jury left to deliberate, and I walked out of that courtroom feeling completely drained. Valentina drove me back to her apartment where I'd been staying since the trial started because I couldn't face going home. The first day of deliberations, I paced her living room for hours, checking my phone every few minutes. The second day, I tried to distract myself with television but couldn't focus on anything. By the third day, I was barely sleeping, just lying in Valentina's guest bed, staring at the ceiling, running through every piece of evidence in my mind. On the fourth day, my phone rang at 2 in the afternoon, and Fiona's name appeared on the screen. She told me the jury had reached a verdict, and I needed to get to the courthouse right away. My hands shook so badly that Valentina had to drive while I sat in the passenger seat trying to breathe normally. We rushed into the courthouse and found seats in the gallery just as the judge called everyone to order. The bailiff brought the jury back in, and I studied each face trying to read what they'd decided. The judge asked the jury foreman to stand and read the verdict. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears as the foreman unfolded the paper. Guilty on voluntary manslaughter. Guilty on evidence tampering. Guilty on embezzlement. Not guilty on first-degree murder. I felt Valentina grab my hand as relief and frustration hit me at the same time. Carl was being held accountable, but the jury didn't believe he intentionally killed our son. The judge thanked the jury and set a sentencing date for 2 weeks later. Then the bailiff led Carl away in handcuffs. He looked back at me one time before disappearing through the door, and I felt absolutely nothing. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed us asking for comments, but Valentina pushed through the crowd and got me to her car. I cried the whole drive back to her apartment. Not sad tears, but angry ones because the verdict felt incomplete. 2 weeks later, I stood in that same courtroom wearing a black dress Valentina helped me pick out. The judge asked if I wanted to read a victim impact statement, and I walked to the podium with a paper covered in my handwriting. I looked directly at Carl sitting at the defense table and started reading. I described how his actions destroyed not just Milo's life, but mine as well. I explained the 3 years I spent searching for my son's killer while sleeping next to the man who killed him. I talked about the way Carl isolated me and controlled me and made sure I never discovered the truth. My voice broke several times, but I kept reading until I reached the end. I told the judge that Carl betrayed every vow he made to me and to our son, that he chose money over his family, and that he deserved the maximum sentence allowed by law. I folded the paper and walked back to my seat next to Valentina, who squeezed my hand. Carl's lawyer asked for leniency, citing his previously clean record and his years of community service. The prosecutor argued that Carl's crimes showed calculated cruelty and a complete lack of remorse. The judge took only a few minutes to decide. She sentenced Carl to 18 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 12 years. She said his betrayal of public trust and his own family warranted the lengthy sentence. The bailiff led Carl away, and this time he didn't look back at me. I walked out of the courthouse with Valentina, and we made it halfway down the steps before someone called my name. Carter stood near the bottom of the stairs looking nervous. She approached slowly and apologized again for the fear she caused breaking into my home. I looked at this young woman who'd been carrying the truth about my son's death for 3 years and felt something complicated. I told her I understood why she did it, and while I couldn't exactly thank her for having an affair with my husband, I was grateful she brought the truth to light. She nodded and wiped her eyes and said she hoped I could find some peace now. Then she walked away, and I never saw her in person again. The divorce moved fast since Carl couldn't contest anything from prison. My lawyer filed the papers, and within a few weeks, the judge signed off on everything. I was awarded the house and most of our assets because of Carl's criminal actions. Valentina took time off work to help me pack up all of Carl's belongings. We filled boxes with his clothes, his books, his personal items, everything that reminded me of the life I thought we had together. Some stuff we donated and some we just threw away. We hired a locksmith to change every single lock in the house so I could reclaim the space as my own. Valentina helped me rearrange furniture and take down photos until the house felt less like Carl's and more like mine. It took 3 full days, but by the end I could walk through my own front door without feeling sick. 3 months after the trial ended, I returned to work. My boss had been understanding about the time off, and my colleagues were supportive when I came back. Some people didn't know how to act around me, and I could see them whispering in the break room. But most were kind and respectful of what I'd been through. My boss called me into her office after my first week back and offered me a promotion. The new position required less travel and came with a significant raise. She said she understood I needed stability and routine as I rebuilt my life. I accepted the promotion and threw myself into work as a way to feel normal again. Fiona started stopping by my house occasionally to check on me. At first I thought she was just doing her job, but over time we developed a real friendship. We'd sit on my back porch drinking coffee and talking about everything except the trial. She told me the department had reopened several other cold cases after Carl's conviction. Hannah's former supervisor was under investigation for corruption and evidence tampering. Other families who'd been told their cases were unsolvable might finally get answers. Fiona said my refusal to give up on finding Milo's killer inspired the department to take a harder look at their old files. 6 months after Carl's conviction, I drove to the cemetery for the first time since learning the truth. I'd been too angry and hurt to visit before, but now I felt ready. I parked near Milo's grave and walked across the grass carrying fresh flowers. I knelt down and traced my fingers over his name carved in the stone. I told my son that I got him justice, that his killer was in prison where he belonged. I said I was sorry it took 3 years, and such a horrible betrayal to get there. I talked to Milo about the scholarship I was planning in his name, and about how much I missed him every single day. I stayed there for over an hour just talking to my son like he could hear me. A week later, an envelope arrived at my house with Carter's handwriting on it. Inside was a letter explaining she was moving to another state for a fresh start. She wrote that she hoped I could find peace now that the truth was known. She said she'd carry guilt about not coming forward sooner for the rest of her life. Tucked in with the letter was a photo of Milo that she'd kept all these years. It showed him smiling at the camera, happy and alive, before everything fell apart. I put the photo in a frame on my mantle where I could see it every day. The following month, I found a support group for families of murder victims. The meetings were held in a church basement every Thursday evening. I walked in nervous and sat in a folding chair while other people shared their stories. When it was my turn, I told them about Milo and Carl and everything that happened. Everyone listened without judgment because they understood in a way most people couldn't. After the meeting, a woman approached me and said her daughter had been killed 5 years ago. She told me that getting justice doesn't erase the grief, but it does allow you to start processing it honestly. She said I'd always carry the pain of losing Milo, but eventually I'd learn to carry it alongside moments of joy and peace. I thanked her and realized I wasn't alone in this anymore. 2 weeks later, Valentina showed up at my door with a duffel bag and told me we were going to the beach. I started to protest about work and responsibilities, but she cut me off and said I needed this more than anything else. We drove 3 hours to a small coastal town where she'd rented a cottage for the week. The first morning I woke up to the sound of waves and for a moment forgot about everything that had happened. We spent our days walking along the shore with our feet in the cold water, collecting shells like we did as kids. Valentina brought photo albums from when Milo was little, and we sat on the porch going through them. I told stories about his first steps, his obsession with dinosaurs, the time he tried to build a rocket in our backyard. She listened to every word and shared her own memories of taking him to the zoo and teaching him to ride a bike. By the 4th day, I noticed something shifting inside me. The heaviness I'd been carrying felt lighter somehow. Not gone, but different. Like I could breathe a little deeper. On our last night there, we built a fire on the beach and watched the stars come out. I thanked Valentina for forcing me to take this trip, and she squeezed my hand without saying anything back. When I returned home, I walked through each room of the house and saw Carl everywhere. His favorite chair in the living room, the kitchen where he made pancakes on Sunday mornings, our bedroom where I'd slept beside a killer for 3 years. I called a realtor the next day. The market was good, and within 2 months I had an offer above asking price. I found a 2-bedroom apartment 15 minutes from Valentina's place. It had big windows that let in natural light and a small balcony where I could drink my coffee in the mornings. Moving day came and I packed up 8 years of my life into boxes. Valentina helped me sort through everything, and we donated most of Carl's belongings to charity. I kept a few photos of Milo from around the house, but left behind anything that reminded me of the life I thought I had. The new apartment felt empty at first, but I slowly filled it with things that were actually mine. Plants for the balcony, new dishes that Carl had never touched, a comfortable reading chair by the window. The first night in my new place, I slept better than I had in months. Milo's birthday arrived 6 months after the trial ended. He would have been 22 years old. I'd been planning something for weeks because I couldn't let the day pass without marking it somehow. I contacted the local university and worked with their financial aid office to establish a memorial scholarship in Milo's name. The scholarship would go to students studying accounting and ethics, specifically those who showed commitment to doing the right thing even when it was hard. The university agreed to match my initial donation, and we set up an annual award of $5,000. On his actual birthday, I attended a small ceremony where the university president announced the scholarship. They'd already selected the first recipient, a young woman who'd reported financial irregularities at her internship, despite pressure to stay quiet. She reminded me so much of Milo that I had to excuse myself to the bathroom to cry. Afterward, she came up and thanked me and said she'd work hard to honor Milo's memory. I gave her a hug and told her he would have been proud to know someone like her. 3 months later, I got a call from Hannah asking if I'd come to a city council meeting. She'd been working with a reform group focused on how police departments handled cold cases. They wanted to present Milo's case as an example of how corruption and pressure from powerful people could derail investigations. Hannah planned to testify about the supervisor who'd pushed her to close the case and focus elsewhere. I agreed to attend and sat in the packed council chambers listening to Hannah explain how her hands had been tied. She talked about the blonde witness who was never properly pursued, the evidence that was overlooked, the pressure from above to move on. Several other families spoke about their own unsolved cases and the obstacles they'd faced. The council members asked tough questions and seemed genuinely concerned about the problems Hannah described. At the end of the hearing, the council president promised to form a task force to review procedures. Hannah caught my eye from the witness table and I nodded to show my support. Changes wouldn't bring Milo back, but maybe they'd help other families get answers faster. A year had passed since Carl's conviction when a letter arrived with the prison's return address. I recognized his handwriting on the envelope and almost threw it away without opening it. But curiosity won, and I sat down at Valentina's kitchen table to read what he had to say. The letter was 3 pages of Carl explaining that he never meant to kill Milo, that it was an accident during an argument that got out of hand. He wrote about his regret and his therapy sessions in prison, and how he'd found religion. He asked for my forgiveness and said he understood if I couldn't give it, but he needed to try. I read through it once without feeling much of anything. Then I walked to Valentina's fireplace, turned on the gas, and held the letter to the flames. I watched the paper curl and blacken and turn to ash. Valentina came home and found me still staring at the fireplace. She asked if I was okay, and I said yes, that I actually was. Carl was in prison where he belonged, and I didn't owe him anything, not even a response. My friends started trying to set me up on dates about 18 months after the divorce was finalized. I resisted at first because the thought of trusting someone new felt impossible. But one of Valentina's coworkers kept mentioning this guy named Eddie who worked in his office. Eventually, I agreed to meet him for coffee just to get everyone off my back. Eddie knew my whole story before we met because Valentina had filled him in. I appreciated that he didn't pretend not to know or ask a bunch of questions. We talked about normal things like movies and books and our jobs. He was patient when I got quiet or changed the subject if something felt too personal. We started seeing each other once a week, then twice. He never pushed for more than I was ready to give. Some days I felt strong and hopeful about the future. Other days I barely got out of bed and he understood that healing wasn't a straight line. 6 months in, and we still took things slow. But I found myself looking forward to seeing him. He made me laugh and didn't treat me like I was broken. The forensic accountants finished their investigation into Carl's embezzlement, and the court ordered him to return the money he'd stolen. Most of it had been sitting in offshore accounts that investigators managed to freeze. The total came to almost $2 million that got returned to his former company. The CEO called me personally to apologize for not catching Carl's crimes sooner. He said the company had failed Milo and failed me. He offered a settlement of $300,000 as compensation for what their lack of oversight had cost my family. My lawyer advised me to take it, and I did. The money went into accounts that would provide financial security for years to come. I donated a portion to the scholarship fund, and used some to help Valentina with repairs on her car. Having that cushion meant I could cut back my work hours and focus on things that mattered more than my job. 2 years after the trial ended, I got a notice about Carl's parole hearing. He was eligible after serving 12 years but could request parole review earlier with good behavior. I debated whether to attend, but ultimately decided the parole board needed to hear from me. I drove to the prison on a cold morning in November and sat in a room with board members, Carl's lawyer and Carl himself in an orange jumpsuit. He'd lost weight and looked older than his years. The board asked him questions about his rehabilitation and his plans if released. He gave careful answers about his therapy and his remorse. Then they asked if anyone wanted to make a statement. I stood up and told them about Milo, about the 3 years I spent searching for his killer while sleeping next to that killer every night. I explained how Carl's actions destroyed not just my son's life, but mine too. I said he deserved to serve his full sentence and that 12 years was already too lenient for taking a life and covering it up. The board thanked me and said they'd make their decision within a week. Carl's parole was denied. I walked out of that prison feeling like a weight had lifted. I could finally close this chapter and focus on building a life defined by more than grief and betrayal. Valentina came to me with an idea about 6 months after the parole hearing. She suggested we start a podcast to help other families dealing with unsolved murders and wrongful convictions. We could share what we learned navigating the criminal justice system and offer support to people who felt lost. I loved the idea immediately. We spent weeks planning episodes and reaching out to experts who could provide advice. We launched the podcast on the 3-year anniversary of learning the truth about Milo's death. The response overwhelmed us. Within the first month, hundreds of people reached out asking for help with their own cases. We connected families with lawyers, investigators, and victim advocates. We interviewed people who'd successfully gotten their cases reopened. We talked about the emotional toll of seeking justice and how to keep going when the system failed you. Valentina handled the technical side while I focused on the interviews and content. Working on the podcast gave me purpose beyond my own story. Every family we helped felt like honoring Milo's memory in a real way. I started visiting Milo's grave every Sunday morning. I'd bring fresh flowers and sit on the grass beside his headstone. I told him about the scholarship recipients and their achievements. I described the families we'd helped through the podcast and the cases that got reopened because of our work. I talked about Eddie and how scary but good it felt to open my heart again. I shared memories from our beach trip with Valentina and how much I wished he could have been there. The grief never went away completely, but it changed shape over time. Instead of the sharp pain that used to knock me down, it became something I could carry alongside the happy memories. I remembered teaching him to swim and helping with homework and watching him graduate high school. Those 20 years I had with my son mattered more than the way he died. Some Sundays I cried at his grave, and other times I smiled remembering something funny he'd said. The visits became a ritual that grounded me and reminded me why I kept fighting to help other families find their own answers. 3 years after the trial ended, I woke up in a bedroom I actually wanted to be in. The walls were painted soft blue instead of the gray Carl had insisted on, and sunlight came through curtains I picked myself. My partner Eddie was already up making coffee in the kitchen of our small house across town from where I used to live. I sold that other place within 6 months of the divorce finalizing and never looked back. The new house had 2 bedrooms, a tiny yard, and 0 bad memories attached to it. I got ready for work at the nonprofit Valentina, and I started Together, the one that helped families navigate cold case investigations. We had 3 full-time staff now and answered over 100 calls each month from people desperate for guidance. The scholarship fund in Milo's name had given out its 3rd round of awards last month, and one of the recipients sent me a thank you card that I kept on my desk. Eddie drove me to work most mornings because my car was ancient and unreliable, and we spent the drive talking about normal things like weekend plans and what to make for dinner. He knew about everything that happened with Carl and Milo, but he didn't treat me like I was broken. Some days the grief still hit hard, and I had to step away from my desk to cry in the bathroom, but those days came less often now. The podcast Valentina and I recorded every week reached thousands of listeners, and we heard from people all over the country who felt less alone because we shared our story. I learned that healing wasn't about forgetting Milo or pretending the betrayal never happened. It meant carrying those experiences while also making room for good things, like my relationship with Eddie and the families we helped through the nonprofit. Tonight was the anniversary of the day I finally learned the truth about how Milo died, and instead of spending it alone and miserable, I invited people over for dinner. Valentina arrived first with wine and stories about her latest disastrous date. Fiona showed up still wearing her detective badge, apologizing for running late from a case. Hannah brought her famous lasagna and gave me a long hug in the doorway. Eddie set the table while I finished the salad, and we all sat down together in my small dining room. We talked about the corruption investigation that grew from Milo's case and how it changed department policies. Fiona told us about 3 cold cases that got reopened because of evidence uncovered during that investigation. Hannah shared updates about her advocacy work pushing for better training on how detectives handle grieving families. Valentina made everyone laugh with impressions of our most dramatic podcast callers. I looked around the table at these people who showed up for me when my whole world fell apart, who helped me find truth and build something meaningful from the worst experience of my life. I lost my son and the husband I thought I knew, but I gained clarity about who really mattered and strength I never knew I had. These people loved me exactly as I was, scars and all, and that felt like enough.